Welcome to The World Below, The War in the Heavens, a podcast exploring the adventure, the intrigue, and the magic of a land that lies beneath the celestial battle between gods and demons, a clash that has gone on since time immemorial. I'm your guide, your interlocutor, and your host, Michael Pryor. Welcome everyone to episode 38 of the World Below, The War in the Heavens podcast, the 8th of season 4. This one is all about King Ruthen I, known as the Headstrong. The overview. Ruthen was born in 487 when his mother Princess Zestia was 22. He was the second oldest of the siblings after his older sister Tristan. He was followed by Varfina, Prescon, Sain and Omir. He was nominated his mother's successor in 501 when he was 14, and he came to the throne upon his mother's death in 507, being crowned early in 508 when he was 20 years of age. He reigned until the year 515 when he died aged 28. As you might have guessed from his nickname, his sobriquet, he was a somewhat inflexible monarch. He was intelligent and widely read, but he did tend to favour his opinion about almost any matter above all others, which led to a series of disasters, the greatest and longest lasting of which was his choice of successor. This decision took Anaquist into a long period of chaos, bloodshed, and nearly the destruction of the realm itself. Early life. His childhood was much as can be expected in an Anaquistian royal household of the time, particularly if we remember that for the reign of his mother and his grandfather, and going back for a good many years, the continent was embroiled in a long-standing and bloody war. So plenty of training in handling weapons, military matters and such like were his upbringing. But Queen Zestia wanted well-rounded children, and so a succession of well-credentialed tutors ambled through the royal household, instructing all of Zestia's offspring, paying particular attention to Ruthen after Zestia anointed him as her chosen heir. One of these tutors was Euphemius Brella. He was more eccentric than most and would sing most of his lessons, whether they be geography, mathematics or history, accompanying himself on a variety of stringed instruments. Towards the end of his life, he wrote a brief memoir of his time as a royal tutor, where he offered pen portraits of each of the royal children. For Ruthen, he commented, "Even at an early age, Prince Ruthen was of a mind so firm that most would call him stubborn. An opinion, once lodged in his head, required something like a crowbar to extricate, and even then the chance of success was low. His customary facial expression was a frown, and his customary posture was with his arms crossed on his chest." Euphemius Brella also notes that the young Ruthen enjoyed arguing and disputation, and was likely to turn any lesson into a debate. Ruthen enjoyed verbal fencing with his siblings, but he was never averse to taking up a contrary stand with adults as well. Perhaps because of this firm-mindedness, young Ruthen spent a good deal of time in any library he could, in pursuit of authorities he could use to support whatever stance he was taking at the time, and he chased up texts with relentless focus. It was this habit that led to his being nominated as his mother's successor. I've discussed many times before in our previous 30-something episodes that succession in Anaquist operated rather differently from the traditional forms of succession you may be familiar with. In short, according to the Compact of Eucantha established by the founding queen of the Anaquists, the reigning monarch can choose their successor from their children in any manner they pleased. Some took what might be called the easy way out and pointed at the oldest child. Others instituted some form of test with criteria of their choosing. A few had more outlandish methods, and Zestia was one of these. When Ruthen was 14, he was ransacking the furthest reaches of the library in the royal apartments, looking for justification for his view that he was old enough to do what he wanted when he wanted, when he came across a dusty tome jammed behind a shelf of books about free will and independence. Never one to let obscure citations fall by the wayside, he stretched and eventually pulled it out, to find it was an edition of the 2nd century hygiene regulations and their enforcement by the famously pedantic magistrate Lecantes Melling. Most 14-year-olds would have immediately tossed the book back, but Ruthen was focused and flipped it open just in case it had some useful material. I suppose it did prove to have some useful material, because when he opened it, a slip of paper fell out, with a message written in his mother's hand: "My successor will bring me this book." Puzzled, Ruthen took this slip of paper along with the book to his mother, who was, at the time, studying a variety of maps of the Perrin border. He handed the paper to her, she read it, her mouth firmed, and she placed both hands on his shoulders. She said, "You will be king after me." Was Zestia's plan that only the most studious of her children would find such a message? Was this the only slip of paper, or had she secreted such messages in many books in many libraries? We have no way of knowing, but in her Annals entry, Queen Zestia noted that the general reaction from her other children was one of relief, perhaps because if it had been anyone else but Ruthen, he would have argued them to death about why it should have been him rather than them. Thereafter, Ruthen's education swung more into more specific instruction on how to be a ruler. That is, plenty of sessions with experienced councillors and senior people in the royal administration. The sort of stuff that would make most young people scream with boredom. But Ruthen took to it with alacrity. He never grew out of his penchant for arguing, but he did find quite quickly that his instructors knew more than he did about many matters, and he learned to listen. Reign highlights the peace. In some ways, Ruthen was extremely lucky to have the mother he did. Queen Zestia brought the long-running war with the inland people to an end, and so Ruthen didn't have to deal with the strife and military preparations that half a dozen monarchs before him had had to. It would seem that the young Ruthen would be well suited to participate in diplomacy and trade negotiations, where his disputatious nature made sure that Anaquist's interests were well taken care of, but after one long and tedious meeting with an envoy from Innerhonf who kept disagreeing with Ruthen's stance, he pounded the table, pointed at the Honfian delegation and snapped, "Yakety-yak, don't talk back," and stormed from the room. After this, he left such matters to the corps of able diplomats his mother had bequeathed him with. He appointed special envoys to the inland people, and he oversaw the establishing of a permanent consulate, if you like, a week's ride from Yemen in the northwest of Anaquist. This consulate became the centre of a lively trading town that lasted for centuries until an appalling earthquake in 1278 destroyed the entire community. It was Ruthen who upgraded the royal mausoleum in Anaquist, the sizable edifice inside the walls of the stronghold, where the bodies of many Anaquistian monarchs had been interred, and would continue to be interred for some time. The old mausoleum had been in need of substantial refurbishing for some time, but Ruthen took a more radical approach, removing all of the sarcophagi and demolishing the old mausoleum before building an austere but perfectly proportioned building with a substantial underground crypt. The above-ground building used a great deal of distinctive grey marble from the island of Afni, off the southwest coast of Anaquist, not far from the border with Tinland. This marble, with its distinctive patterns of light and dark, is found nowhere else on the continent, and so much was used in the construction of the royal mausoleum that very little remained afterwards. The new royal mausoleum was completed in 512, and the project seemed to have given Ruthen some enthusiasm for architecture, because even before the new royal mausoleum was completed, he had embarked upon another major project in the capital, the embassy quarter. Ruthen designated an area to the north of the stronghold, which had never been built on because of a combination of marshiness and ridges of very hard rock, which made construction difficult, as the location for all foreign diplomatic missions. And to facilitate this, he would construct 3 grand consulates for the first foreign realms to take up his offer. 3 smaller states of the time quickly put their hands up: Perrin, Chinland and Outer Honf. They must have chuckled with glee when they took up residence in 510, as the buildings were lavishly appointed and very well constructed after the Royal Engineers had used army labour to drain the area and to excavate the foundations. Thereafter followed somewhat of a rush not to be left out of this new embassy quarter. Almost every other realm abandoned the buildings they had been using, and a mini building boom followed, with grand embassies and consulates soon being erected. In a sort of follow the leader thing, any trading house worth its salt wanted to be near the embassy quarter, of course, and real estate prices in the area escalated. The embassy quarter soon became one of the most desirable parts of Anaquist, and so it remains today. The Ruthenian reforms. Being ambitious, as all members of the Anaquistian dynasty seemed to be, a genetic thing maybe, Ruthen wanted to find an avenue other than diplomacy and architecture to make his name resound in the roll call of Anaquistian monarchs. He decided to reform the judiciary and the legal system. The Ruthenian reforms did indeed preserve Ruthen's name right until the modern day in Anaquist. His overhaul of the existing system was thoughtful, wide-ranging and extremely well argued, especially after he imprisoned a number of judges from a group that had pretty much become hereditary, with judges passing their position on to their children for generations. Ruthen put an end to that. The existing system had been prone to cronyism and corruption on a fairly mild scale. It had essentially been established in the reign of Queen Sendia II in the early 300s, when any judicial decision-making below the most important was given to a haphazard arrangement of village elders, local landholders, and the more prosperous and well-born Anaquistians who had a fair amount of time on their hands. The system worked well enough, although with many notable examples of injustice. But the war with the inland people highlighted problems with ordinary people seeking fair outcomes in civil disputes, but also for those accused of crimes. With so much of Anaquist devoted to the war effort, military justice proceedings took precedence and often caused clashes with local civil authorities. With the peace, Ruthen saw his opportunity to weigh in on the sort of matters that appealed to him greatly, sorting out disputation in a way that would be fair to all, especially the Crown, which retained ultimate authority. In essence, the judges were acting on behalf of the monarch, who reserved their right to review. Ruthen wasn't going to give that up. Ruthen ordered that a number of levels of permanent courts were to be set up in the capital, ranging from one dealing with petty matters right through to one that he imagined would only sit in extreme circumstances to deal with cases pertaining to the safety of the realm. In addition, a company of judges was appointed with a roaming commission to set up and adjudicate at temporary courts across Anaquist from east to west, from north to south. All judges were to rotate through the court hierarchy, serving limited time at each level before moving on, and each and every one of them would have to undertake their time as the itinerant regional roving judges before starting at the nominal bottom of the ladder again. Ruthen summarily retired all existing judges, giving them very generous pensions, which mostly stilled any protest. He wanted a new brand of judges who would be happy to implement his new judicial arrangements, and to that effect he established a judicial college in a wing of the Hypogeum. To head this bright and shiny new institution, Ruthen appointed Euphemius Brella, his one-time childhood tutor, and gave him orders to accept bright young people from right across every social stratum, from right across the realm. He gave orders also not to overlook older candidates either, those with some experience in business, the arts and trades, but also the military and even the temple. He wanted these older candidates especially to be put through a crash course to get them out there and judging, because his removal of existing judges had immediately exacerbated an existing backlog. There were plenty of teething problems, of course, but the new system quickly found favour with the people of Anaquist, who generally saw it as a fairer system than the one they had been putting up with. The new judiciary exercised its powers carefully, and very few cases were ever referred to a more senior court on what we would call appeal. Ruthen did decree one innovation that was very quickly rescinded, as eccentric at best and unworkable at worst. He wanted all judges who heard complaints and cases to be blindfolded, unable to see who was appearing before them. He must have thought it sounded fine in theory, an excellent implementation of the blind justice principle, but when one roving judge on regional deployment tripped over a sleeping dog in the tavern that was serving as a temporary courtroom and broke a leg, the entire judiciary implored Ruthen to think twice about this arrangement and then get rid of it, which he did, but not before he tried blindfolding himself and making his way around the royal apartments unaided. A 200-year-old vase was the victim of this experiment, and evidence enough that blindfolds weren't practical in these sort of circumstances. An aside here. Well, of course, you'll note that I've made no mention of juries. The Anaquistian court system never discovered or imagined the notion of a group of peers coming to a decision about matters civil or criminal. Judge only was the Anaquistian tradition, quite different from other realms on the continent and a fiercely guarded one. It was the bedrock of Anaquistian justice that judges drawn from a well-trained body were the best way of deciding affairs. It's said that occasionally Ruthen enjoyed disguising himself and sitting in the back of these new courtrooms he had established, and on more than one occasion he was ejected for jumping to his feet and attempting to argue with advocates. The Ruthenian reforms became the foundation of the Anaquistian judiciary and legal systems right through to the modern day, and he is rightly praised for his thoughtfulness and his willingness for radical reform in a part of society that had already become hidebound and overly conservative. The succession. All of this should make Ruthen seem like a busy young man, and in fact many have called him driven, as he juggled a number of major projects at the same time, never finishing one before launching another. The military history of the previous 100 years or so had been emphasised to him and his siblings so much, though, that it appears as if the lack of an opportunity to participate in battle, or even to oversee an Anaquistian military success, gnawed at him. While he was still completing the royal mausoleum works and the establishment of the embassy quarter, he increasingly spent time with the commanders of the army and the navy. Now, I imagine that putting up with this sort of thing is part of the job description of senior military commanders. After all, ultimate military authority in Anaquist always remained with the monarch. But the trouble was that many monarchs took that as license to, shall we say, interfere, dabble, stick their oar in. Any military commander worth their salt surely had a bunch of strategies up their sleeve to deal with amateurs like these, the dilettantes with inordinate power. And this is not to denigrate any of the great Anaquistian monarchs who were fully in charge of their armed forces, like Ruthen's grandmother, Sendia III. But for every Queen Sendia, there's a Ruthen, who, when all said and done, was truly one of those enthusiasts who loved to offer opinions about matters to do with the army and the navy, and who loved to see these opinions being put into practice, with no regard to how well founded these opinions were or how such opinions affect the budget. In 512, Ruthen, with his newfound enthusiasm and experience with building projects, ordered that the central army barracks in Anaquist was to be no more, and that a new and better building was to be constructed. A site was obtained only half a mile away, and the best architects competed to be in charge of the project. To give Ruthen his due, senior army commanders were consulted, and they were part of the decision-making, with the result that the new barracks, completed in under 24 months, were widely admired and begrudgingly accepted as a great improvement on the old. Can a monarch be emboldened? Ruthen seemed to be, and soon he was offering his suggestions, and they remained couched as such, on matters such as uniforms of various regiments, improvements to procurement, the establishment of a specialised cartographic unit, the use of the navy to establish regular dredging of the Miro River near river ports, and even the best sort of glassware in the officers' mess in the capital. The army commanders used the standard tactics of deflection, agreement when suggestions were actually useful, and the all-time best tactic of referring suggestions to a board of inquiry where, with the right sort of board members, such suggestions would get bogged in a mire and not see the light of day for years. So much so normal operating procedure, except that Ruthen found an ally within the military. Valentin Gestos was a mid-level infantry commander stationed in the main Anaquist barracks in the capital. By chance he was appointed to guide King Ruthen around his inspection tour of the old barracks at the beginning of his project to upgrade the facility. Ruthen found his company amenable, most likely because Gestos was around his own age, a refreshing break from the curmudgeonly army old-timers with whom he had been dealing. Gestos was from an unremarkable background, his family being wheat farmers in the central north of Anaquist, but he was quick-witted, and while respectful, he had an appealing, sardonic manner. Within a matter of months, Ruthen had requested that Gestos be seconded to him, personally, as a military attaché or aide, and promised the highest military authorities that Gestos would be much in demand liaising with various branches of the military and helping to facilitate Ruthen's plans. Being indispensable to a headstrong monarch could be a precarious position, but Gestos was a hard worker, and while no one could be as ambitious as an Anaquist, Gestos had a fair helping of aspiration himself. After a while he found that he could mock Ruthen, and that the king actually enjoyed it, and Gestos became one of the few to ridicule the king with impunity. With the success of the various military building projects, Ruthen's young protégé needed promoting, and so Gestos climbed the ladder through the ranks at a speed that raised more than a few eyebrows. And here's where a story that was bordering on the scandalous becomes a tragic one. We have to remember that Ruthen was a young man, only in his mid-20s. Conscious of one of the most important duties of a monarch, he had spent time with a number of eligible young women of Anaquist and of other realms. In late 510 it appeared as if he had settled upon Princess Welendia of the far north-eastern kingdom of Kildare. In 511 she took up residence in the royal apartments with the blessing of her parents, and Ruthen and Welendia were the golden couple of Anaquist, brightening any official engagement they attended, and they made a striking and happy couple. They appeared to be very much in love. In 513, however, Princess Welendia suffered an accident while out riding and severely broke a leg. Infection set in, then blood poisoning, and she died horribly. The heartbroken Ruthen had the young princess interred in the royal mausoleum. Grief set in, and Ruthen's behaviour became erratic. His building works continued, but by this time they were overseen by Gestos. There was even some suggestion that they weren't simply overseen by the young man, they were actually originated by him, under the auspices of a king who had retreated from public gaze. Toward the end of 514, the entire realm was shocked when the 26-year-old Gestos was appointed to a new position on order of the king, Grand Commander of all Anaquistian forces. Naturally, the existing commanders of the army and the navy protested in the strongest terms, but Gestos's new position was supported by the establishment of a commander's guard, a newly constituted company of elite troops who were ready to enforce the king's edicts. This new unit was made up primarily of friends of Gestos, who were utterly loyal to him, and were quite happy to muscle aside those who they saw as old-fashioned. Gestos managed the army well enough, with his cronies, perhaps because the army had little fighting to do at the time. He continued Ruthen's program of modernising buildings across the realm, and even the most ardent of his detractors admitted that this was done reasonably well. Gestos was a young man on the rise, but he was a young man who made many enemies while he did so. In the meantime, Ruthen was a shadow, barely appearing in public. His advisory council carried on much of the regular business of the monarchy, and so Anaquist didn't suffer much. However, his advisers gently, then more strongly, began to urge Ruthen to start considering another partner to ensure the survival of the dynasty. After some time of these increasingly insistent approaches, Ruthen regained some of his disputatious nature and declared that since the matter of the succession was in his hands, he would do something about it. And in 515, a frail Ruthen announced, in a New Year's Day address to the people, that his heir would be Valentin Gestos. To say that this caused uproar would be putting it mildly. A crowd that had gathered in the forecourt in front of the royal palace, upon hearing this announcement, the people were momentarily stunned and then a riot broke out. This is pretty much standard operating procedure, as Anaquistians have always been keen to express their political views in robust fashion. Ruthen surveyed this wide-scale brawl for some time and then, saying nothing, turned and retreated to his royal apartments again. Valentin Gestos called out the troops. The riot was put down with only a few casualties, and he ascended to the royal balcony, where he declared that he would decline this great honour, and boos turned to cheers. Ruthen's announcement naturally shocked his 5 siblings, Tristan, Varfina, Presconsain and Omier. They tried to see him, to counsel him that this was not the way the succession was meant to work, that it had to remain within the Anaquist family, but they were prevented from seeing him by Gestos's commander's guard. The 5 siblings saw the way the wind was blowing and secretly left the capital the next day. They convened at Tristan's country estate in the highlands, near the source of the Inman River. Then they divided and took to their own estates to assemble troops. The next day, Gestos was summoned to the throne room where, in front of a crowd of nobles, senior military figures and influential merchants, a distracted and visibly unwell king once again announced his intention to name Gestos his heir. Gestos knelt and declared that if it was the wish of the king, who was he to say otherwise? The following day, Ruthen died of what the surviving member of his team of physicians vowed was poison. From their country estates, the royal princes and princesses proclaimed that they would never allow Gestos to take the throne. And so the restoration period of Anaquistian history ends and the internecine wars began. Personal life. One of the more contradictory monarchs of Anaquist, Ruthen was vigorous, energetic and intelligent, but he suffered from what he probably saw as a lack of outlets for his talents. He was of medium height, but people often remarked that he had the shoulders of a much taller man. He was notably quick in his gestures, perhaps even dismissive, and it was also remarked that he was rarely still, often drumming his fingers or tapping a foot while listening to petitioners. Last words. Easily led, gullible or simply hoodwinked. It's interesting to think about what sort of monarch Ruthen might have been if he hadn't fallen in with Valentin Gestos. He might have ended up being known as Ruthen the Builder, and he might have been hailed as the monarch who made Anaquist look as it does today, but his life was cut short. Perhaps he simply wasn't a man for peaceful times. And that's all for Season 4, Episode 8 of the World Below the War in the Heavens podcast. Next episode, the vast and exotic tropical land of Vez Besselie. This has been The World Below the War in the Heavens, a podcast exploring the history, culture and esoterica of the world below, a continent of magic and mystery with inhabitants who keep one eye on the sky at all times. I've been your host, Michael Pryor. If you'd like to find out more about me and my books, pop over to www.michaelpryor.com.au. Farewell.